The morning of November 21st, 1944, over the skies of Germany, 35,000 pounds of American engineering screams through ice-laden clouds at 28,000 feet. Inside the cockpit of B-17G number 4338545, Lieutenant Harold R. DeBolt fights to keep his bomber level, but the aircraft has other plans. This flying fortress, so new it hasn't even earned a nickname yet, is on its third mission. It will never need a name. What happens in the next 2 hours will give it a legend instead. The target that day was Merseburg. If you flew bombers for the 8th Air Force in late 1944, that name alone could drain the colour from your face. Dreaded Merseburg, they called it. The Leuna synthetic oil refinery sprawled across 250 buildings, an industrial labyrinth that fed the German war machine. 400 anti-aircraft guns ringed the complex, twice as many as defended Berlin. From May of 1944 to April of 1945, American bombers dropped thousands of tons of explosives on Merseburg. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. 119 planes never came home. 1,280 airmen died in the flak-filled skies above that city. DeBolt knew all this as his formation climbed through the weather that morning. He was flying his 33rd mission, a veteran by any measure in a war where completing 25 missions earned you a ticket home. His co-pilot, 2nd Lieutenant Osborne Stone from Derry, New Hampshire, sat beside him. Stone was 23 years old, weighed 132 pounds, and had never jumped from an aircraft in his life. Behind them, 8 more crew members manned their stations: bombardier, navigator, radio operator, engineer, gunners. 9 states represented, 9 men who trusted their pilot completely. One aircraft that was about to betray that trust in the most inexplicable way imaginable. The weather was terrible. Solid clouds everywhere, towering, cumulus formations that forced the bombers to climb higher and fight harder just to maintain formation. Visibility dropped to nothing. Ice built up on the wings. The formation began to string out as planes struggled through the turbulence. Then, as they approached the initial point for their bomb run, everything that could go wrong did. The formation slowed as it turned toward the target. With bomb bay doors open, DeBolt's aircraft stalled. The B-17 dropped out of formation, falling away from the protective mass of bombers that had kept German fighters at bay. Immediately, they were alone. Immediately, they were vulnerable. The flak batteries below didn't miss the opportunity. Black bursts erupted around them. The distinctive boom of 88mm guns filled the air, that particular percussion that every bomber crew learned to recognize and fear. Then came the impacts, direct hits. The first shell tore into the number 3 engine, the inboard power plant on the right wing. Metal screamed. The engine mount shattered. Later, DeBolt would describe it simply: the shell knocked the mount through the wing itself. A tremendous flash of light filled the entire aircraft, a red explosion that seemed to consume everything. "We've taken a direct hit in the bomb bay," DeBolt said over the intercom, his voice remarkably calm given what he was thinking. "For the life of me, I don't know why the bombs didn't blow up." 4,000 pounds of high explosives sat in the belly of his aircraft, and a German shell had just detonated inside the very compartment that held them. Smoke filled the fuselage. Fire licked at control surfaces. The bomb rack had been damaged by the impact, jammed beyond repair. They couldn't drop their bombs, couldn't complete their mission, couldn't even lighten their load for the long flight home. Number 3, engine was dead, its propeller windmilling uselessly. The bomber began losing altitude, slowly at first, then faster. DeBolt made the only decision he could. He turned the aircraft away from Merseburg, away from the target, away from the formation that had already moved beyond help. He pointed the nose west, toward England, toward home, toward safety that was nearly 200 miles away across occupied Europe. But the aircraft had other ideas. The B-17 continued to lose altitude. 600 feet per minute, steady and relentless. DeBolt ordered the crew to start throwing things overboard, ammunition cans, equipment, anything not bolted down. They complied immediately, tossing gear through the waist windows, watching their supplies tumble away into the clouds below. It made no difference. The aircraft kept sinking. Then the weather closed in completely. Thick clouds swallowed them whole. Visibility dropped to zero. They were flying blind, descending through hostile airspace, with German fighters somewhere in the murk and German flak batteries tracking them from below. The situation was deteriorating with every passing second. A big red flash suddenly filled the aircraft again. Another hit, or perhaps secondary damage from the first, no one could say for certain in the chaos. What was certain was that the bomber was dying. A second engine began to fail, its temperature gauges climbing into the red as coolant bled away or cylinders cracked under stress. The aircraft was running out of power, running out of altitude, running out of time. DeBolt pushed the remaining engines to maximum power, but mathematics is unforgiving. 2 engines cannot do the work of 4, not when you're carrying 4,000 pounds of bombs you cannot jettison, not when you're at altitude in freezing weather with ice loading your wings. The altimeter unwound steadily. 20,000 feet, 15,000, 10,000. The English Channel was still miles ahead, and they were never going to make it. The pilot made a new decision. He turned south, toward Brussels, toward Allied territory that British and American forces had liberated 2 months earlier. Better to bail out over friendly ground than risk the Channel or German-held France. He informed the crew of his intentions. They needed to prepare to jump. None of them wanted to. The B-17 was still flying. Despite the damage, despite the lost engines, despite the smoke and the altitude loss, the aircraft was somehow maintaining controlled flight. But DeBolt had no choice. The mathematics said they would hit the ground before they reached safety. He gave the order. The crew began snapping on parachutes. The ones they found were spare chutes, additional packs stored aboard for emergencies just like this. Their personal chutes had been sitting ready at their stations all along, but in the smoke and confusion, several men grabbed the spares instead. It wouldn't matter until later, until British soldiers climbed into an empty aircraft and wondered how men had bailed without parachutes. DeBolt descended to 2,000 feet, still too high for a controlled crash, but low enough that parachutes would deploy safely. The bomber was stable despite everything. The trim tabs were set. The autopilot, a crude mechanical system called the Sperry A-3A, was engaged. The aircraft wanted to fly level, and absent control inputs to the contrary, it would. At 800 feet, DeBolt gave the final order. Bail out. One by one, the crew went. The bombardier through the nose hatch, the navigator behind him, the radio operator through the radio room door, the engineer and gunners through the waist windows. They jumped into fog and uncertainty, their parachutes snapping open in the cold November air, the ground invisible below them until the last seconds before impact. Osborne Stone, the co-pilot, was second to last. He stood at the escape hatch, looked back at DeBolt one final time, then jumped. His first and last parachute jump, he fell through the clouds, the silk canopy above him, his hands gripping the risers, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, but none of them about what would happen to the aircraft they'd just abandoned. DeBolt remained alone in the cockpit for perhaps 30 seconds more. He trimmed the aircraft one last time, adjusted the throttles to a setting he hoped would keep it stable, checked the autopilot was engaged. Then he too abandoned his station. The pilot walked back through the empty fuselage, past the scattered equipment and the guns pointing at nothing, to the waist door. He jumped at under 800 feet, the absolute minimum for safe parachute deployment. His chute opened with a brutal snap. The ground rushed up. He hit hard in a muddy Belgian field and twisted his ankle on impact. Above him, the B-17 kept flying. Stone landed in a round park in a small village near Brussels. He could see civilians approaching, but he didn't know if they were friendly or if German soldiers were hidden nearby. The Americans had liberated this area, but pockets of German resistance remained, and the Battle of the Bulge was just weeks away. An elderly man ran toward him carrying an axe. Stone's hand went to his service pistol. Then the man shouted, "Allez, allez! Quick, quick!" in French, not German. The man led Stone to a schoolhouse where, miraculously, his crew was gathering. All 9 men who had jumped were safe. Some had twisted ankles or bruised ribs from hard landings, but they were alive and in Allied hands. British infantry had picked them up as they descended and rushed them to safety. Within hours, they would all be accounted for at an Allied airbase near Brussels. They assumed their bomber had crashed within minutes of their bailout. They mourned its loss but celebrated their survival. The aircraft had done its job, keeping them alive long enough to escape. Now it was gone, scattered across some Belgian field in pieces, another casualty of the air war over Europe. Except it wasn't. The bomber kept flying. With no one aboard, no hands on the controls, no eyes scanning the instruments, the B-17 continued west. The autopilot held the wings level. The 2 remaining engines provided just enough thrust to maintain something resembling controlled flight. The aircraft was descending, slowly and steadily, but it was descending in a glide rather than a dive. Aerodynamics and mechanical systems worked in concert to keep the machine alive. The weather began to clear as the bomber crossed into Allied-held Belgium. The clouds broke apart. Visibility improved. On the ground, British soldiers at an RAF anti-aircraft battery near Kortenberg looked up and saw something they couldn't quite process. A massive American bomber was approaching their position. Its landing gear was down. 3 of its 4 engines were running. It was descending fast, too fast, but it was under control. It looked exactly like an aircraft making an emergency landing. The British soldiers scrambled to their stations, assuming a damaged crew was trying to reach safety. They cleared the area around their anti-aircraft guns, preparing for impact. The B-17 cleared their position by yards. It smacked into the ground in a nearby ploughed field with tremendous force. The impact was so violent that one wingtip dug into the earth. The aircraft bounced, twisted, and ground-looped across the field, tearing a furrow through the Belgian soil. One propeller crumpled and stopped. The other 3 engines continued running, their deep rumble echoing across the quiet countryside. The aircraft came to rest 90 feet from the anti-aircraft position it had nearly crashed into. The engines ticked over at idle. Smoke rose from damaged panels. The bomber sat tilted slightly to one side, its belly on the ground, its landing gear having failed to absorb the brutal impact. But it was intact. The wings hadn't sheared off. The fuselage hadn't broken. The bombs hadn't exploded. Against all probability, the B-17 had landed itself. The British soldiers waited. No one emerged from the aircraft. No hatches opened. No crew stumbled out seeking help. After 15 minutes, they began to wonder if everyone aboard was dead or too injured to move. After 20 minutes, Major John V. Crisp, the battery commander, approached the silent bomber with growing unease. Crisp walked around the aircraft first, examining it from the outside. He found no flak damage, none. The only damage he could see was from the hard landing itself, the crumpled propeller, the scraped belly, the buckled panels from impact, but no bullet holes, no shell fragments, no evidence of the combat damage that should have forced an emergency landing. How was that possible? The crew had bailed out over Germany after taking multiple direct hits. Where was the damage? He climbed aboard through a hatch, calling out for survivors. No response. He made his way forward through the fuselage, and what he found made no sense at all. The interior showed signs of recent occupation. Half-eaten chocolate bars lay on the navigator's table. Fur-lined flying jackets were draped over equipment. The code book for daily identification signals sat open on the navigator's desk, exactly where it should be during a mission. The Sperry bomb sight remained undamaged in the nose, its cover folded neatly beside it. Coffee thermoses sat upright, their contents not spilled despite the violent landing. But there was no crew, not a single man, no bodies, no wounded, no one hiding, no one unconscious. The aircraft was completely empty. Major Crisp stood in the eerie silence, 3 engines still rumbling behind him, and tried to understand what he was seeing. After several minutes of trial and error, he managed to shut down the engines. The sudden quiet was almost worse than the noise. He found the aircraft log at the navigator's station. The last entry, written in what must have been moments of chaos over Germany, consisted of just 2 words: bad flak. That was all. No explanation, no details, just those 2 words to explain why this bomber was here with no one aboard. Then Crisp made his most disturbing discovery. He found approximately 12 parachutes in the fuselage, neatly wrapped and ready to clip on. 12 unused parachutes in an aircraft that had no crew. The implications were impossible to reconcile. If the crew had bailed out, how had they done so without taking their parachutes? If they hadn't bailed out, where were they? The investigation that followed would provide some answers but raise even more questions. Crisp reported the serial number to headquarters. The 8th Air Force identified the aircraft as belonging to the 91st Bombardment Group, stationed at RAF Bassingbourn in East Anglia, England. Yes, it had taken off that morning with a full crew. Yes, it had been on the Merseburg mission. But where were the men? 2 days later, all 10 crew members were located safe and sound at Allied air bases in Belgium. They had all parachuted to safety, been picked up by British infantry and American forces, and were waiting for transport back to England. Lieutenant DeBolt filed his after-action report. He described the flak hits, the engine damage, the failed bomb bay, the altitude loss, the decision to bail out over friendly territory. He described setting the autopilot and pointing the aircraft toward Brussels before jumping at low altitude. What he couldn't describe was what happened next, because DeBolt, like the rest of his crew, assumed their bomber had crashed within minutes. They'd watched it disappear into the clouds as they descended beneath their parachutes, certain they would never see it again. They mourned its loss but accepted it as inevitable given the damage. When investigators told DeBolt his aircraft had landed itself, nearly intact, in a Belgian field miles from where he'd bailed out, he didn't believe them at first. When they showed him photographs of the bomber sitting in that ploughed field, engines still warm, interior still set up for combat operations, he stared at the images in silence. Finally, he spoke. "She didn't need me after all," he said quietly. But the investigators had questions that DeBolt's account couldn't answer. If the aircraft was hit by flak multiple times, where was the exterior damage? Major Crisp had found none. Every expert who examined the bomber after landing confirmed the same thing. The only damage visible was from the hard landing itself. The engines showed no signs of shell impacts. The wings had no holes. The fuselage was intact. Either DeBolt was mistaken about the severity of the damage, or something impossible had happened. The parachute mystery was even stranger. DeBolt insisted his crew had bailed out with parachutes. Several men confirmed the same story. They remembered clipping on their chutes, checking their harnesses, jumping into the void, yet Major Crisp had found 12 unused parachutes aboard the empty aircraft. The logical explanation was that these were spare chutes, stored aboard for emergencies, and the crew had used their personal parachutes. But that didn't quite fit the evidence either, because some of the found parachutes looked like they'd been recently handled, moved, possibly even partially unpacked before being set aside. Then there was the landing gear question. Why was the landing gear down? DeBolt couldn't remember lowering it. In fact, he specifically didn't remember lowering it, because why would he? He'd been preparing to bail out of a dying aircraft. The last thing on his mind would have been putting the gear down for a landing that would never happen. Yet the British soldiers on the ground all reported the same thing. The B-17 approached, with its landing gear extended, as if preparing for a normal landing. The bomber's autopilot offered a partial explanation. The Sperrier 3A system was primitive by modern standards but capable of maintaining heading and altitude through a series of gyroscopes connected to servo motors. If engaged, and properly trimmed, it could keep an aircraft flying straight and level for considerable distances. DeBolt confirmed he'd engaged the autopilot before jumping. That explained how the aircraft maintained controlled flight after the crew departed. But autopilots don't extend landing gear. They don't adjust trim for changing weight as fuel burns off. They don't avoid obstacles or correct for engine failures or compensate for battle damage. Yet this aircraft had somehow done all of those things, or enough of them to accomplish the impossible, landing itself safely in Allied territory. The official investigation concluded with language that satisfied no one. Escape and returned. 21 November 1944. AC number 4338545. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Plane went on to land in a field near the base. It ground looped at the end of the field and British troops ran out to save the crew, but there was no crew. They had all bailed out and were picked up by British infantrymen. The international news picked up the story as the Phantom Plane. Stars and Stripes published the story on December 8, 1944. They called it the Ghost Ship, the Phantom Fortress, the bomber that flew itself home. Crews across England and Europe heard about it and didn't believe it. They'd all heard tales, of course, war-breed stories. But this one was different. This one had witnesses, British soldiers who'd watched it land, a major who'd climbed inside and found no one, photographs of the empty aircraft, an entire crew, alive and well, confirming they'd abandoned it. The legend grew with each retelling. Some said the autopilot had achieved consciousness, guiding the bomber to safety through artificial intelligence. Others claimed divine intervention, angels piloting the aircraft to prevent it falling into German hands. The most superstitious insisted the bomber was actually haunted, that the spirits of dead airmen had taken control to bring their bird home one last time. The rational explanations were less dramatic, but equally fascinating. Aviation experts studying the incident concluded that a perfect storm of circumstances had conspired to keep the aircraft flying. The autopilot, properly engaged and trimmed, maintained basic stability. The two remaining engines provided enough thrust to sustain a slow, controlled descent rather than a dive. The cold, dense air at altitude increased lift and helped keep the heavy bomber aloft longer than expected. The prevailing winds from the east pushed the aircraft westward, toward Allied territory, adding miles to its uncontrolled flight. The landing gear question remained a mystery, but one engineer proposed a solution. Perhaps the hydraulic system, damaged by the supposed flak hits that no one could actually find evidence of, had failed in a way that allowed the gear to drop under gravity. It was a long shot, but it was possible. Most B-17 seconds had manual gear extension as a backup to the hydraulic system, and if the hydraulics failed while someone was manipulating the manual release, the gear would drop and lock into place. But who had been manipulating the manual release if the crew had already bailed? Unless someone had tried to lower the gear before jumping, perhaps thinking it might help the aircraft survive a crash landing, and the mechanism completed its cycle after that person had already left the plane. It was speculation, but it fit the known facts better than any supernatural explanation. What couldn't be disputed was the achievement itself. A 35,000-pound aircraft, damaged in combat, abandoned by its crew at low altitude, had somehow flown itself for miles through Belgian airspace before executing something resembling a landing. Not a perfect landing, not even a good landing by any standard measure, but a landing nonetheless. The aircraft remained largely intact. The structure was sound enough that, with repairs, it could theoretically fly again. No civilians were injured. No property was damaged beyond a ploughed field that needed reploughing anyway. For the men who'd jumped from that aircraft, the ghost ship legend would follow them for the rest of their lives. Osborne Stone returned to Derry, New Hampshire after the war. He lived to age 90, never forgot his one and only parachute jump. Never stopped marvelling at the photograph. Investigators showed him of his aircraft sitting peacefully in a Belgian field and waiting patiently for a crew that would never return. Harold DeBolt completed his tour of duty shortly after the Phantom Fortress incident. He came home to California and rarely spoke about the war, but when he did, that mission came up more than any other. The mission where his aircraft decided it didn't need him. The mission that proved machines sometimes have wills of their own, or at least behave as if they do. The 91st Bombardment Group, known as the Ragged Irregulars, would go on to complete 340 missions during World War II. They suffered the highest losses of any heavy bombardment group in the war, testament to the grinding brutality of daylight strategic bombing over Europe. But of all those missions, of all those aircraft lost and crews killed, one story stood out above the rest. Not a story of death or destruction, but of survival against all logic. The Phantom Fortress represented something beyond its factual mystery. It became a symbol of the B-17 itself, of Boeing's engineering philosophy that prioritized survivability above all else. The Flying Fortress earned its nickname through stories exactly like this one. Stories of bombers shot to pieces that somehow stayed in the air. Stories of aircraft with dead engines and shredded control surfaces that brought their crews home anyway. Stories that shouldn't be possible but happened so regularly that they stopped seeming impossible. German pilots who fought against B-17 formations learned to respect the aircraft's sheer toughness. Luftwaffe test pilots who flew captured fortresses came away impressed by the redundancy built into every system, the structural strength that allowed the bomber to absorb punishment that would destroy lesser aircraft. But even those experienced German aviators would have struggled to explain what happened on November 21, 1944. Because the Phantom Fortress didn't just survive damage. It didn't just limp home with a wounded crew keeping it alive through skill and determination. It flew itself home with no crew at all, accomplished something that should have been aerodynamically impossible, and landed itself in Allied territory through sheer dumb luck or something more profound than luck. The aircraft was eventually salvaged. The notation in its file read simply, "Salvaged." Lieutenant Harold R. DeBolt, 9 crewmen returned to duty. The bomber probably never flew again. The hard landing had done more damage than was worth repairing, and by late 1944, replacement B-17 seconds were being built faster than crews could be trained to fly them. But its legend endured. In crew-ready rooms across England, pilots told the story to new arrivals. "See that? That's what a fortress can do. Even without you, she'll try to get home." The psychological impact was significant. Knowing your aircraft might survive even if you didn't gave crews confidence that translated to better performance under fire. It reduced panic in emergencies. It made men more willing to stick with damaged aircraft, to try to bring them home rather than bail out at the first sign of trouble. But the Phantom Fortress also revealed an uncomfortable truth that military planners preferred not to discuss. If an aircraft could fly itself and land itself, even by accident, what did that say about the necessity of pilots? The question would become more relevant in later decades as unmanned aerial vehicles evolved from theoretical concepts to practical reality. But in 1944, it was merely a philosophical curiosity, one more mystery, in a war full of them. The technical explanation for what happened that day lies in understanding the B-17's design philosophy and the specific circumstances of November 21, 1944. Boeing's engineers had created an aircraft with inherent aerodynamic stability that prioritized crew survival above all else. The Flying Fortress earned its nickname through exactly this kind of resilience. The wing design was critical. The B-17 featured a massive wing with an aspect ratio of 7.58 to 1 and a long chord that created tremendous surface area. The wing incorporated 4.5 degrees of dihedral, meaning the wings angled upward from the fuselage. This dihedral angle provided natural roll stability. When the aircraft tilted to one side, aerodynamic forces automatically pushed it back toward level flight. It was a passive stability system built into the very shape of the aircraft. The wing also featured 8.25 degrees of sweepback on the leading edge and a carefully calculated incidence of 3.5 degrees. These design choices created an aircraft that wanted to fly straight and level, that resisted departures from controlled flight, that forgave pilot errors and battle damage. The B-17 was stable in ways that many contemporary aircraft were not. That enormous tail was equally important. After early models showed inadequate directional stability, Boeing redesigned the vertical stabilizer and dorsal fin, creating the distinctive large tail that became the Flying Fortress's trademark. The redesigned tail not only solved defensive blind spots by providing room for a tail gunner, It also dramatically improved lateral stability. The massive vertical surface acted like the fin on an arrow, keeping the aircraft pointed into the relative wind. This combination of wing and tail design created what engineers call positive static stability. Disturb the aircraft from level flight, and it will, on its own, try to return to that condition. It won't succeed perfectly without pilot input, but it will resist the disturbance. An aircraft with positive static stability can fly hands-off for considerable periods under the right conditions. The autopilot system added another layer to this inherent stability. The C-1 autopilot, used in B-17 seconds, was manufactured by the Minneapolis Honeywell Regulator Company as an improvement over the original Sperry gyroscope autopilot. The system consisted of 2 spinning gyroscopes located in cases attached to the airplane. The flight gyro, positioned near the aircraft's center of gravity, detected changes in roll and pitch. The directional gyro, located in the bombsight stabilizer, detected changes in yaw. These gyroscopes sent electrical signals to servos connected to the aircraft's control surfaces. The servos moved the ailerons, elevator, and rudder to counteract any detected motion away from the desired flight path. The system could fly the aircraft through gentle maneuvers, including banks, turns, and slight altitude changes. When coupled with the Norden bombsight, it created a stable platform necessary for accurate high-altitude bombing. But the C-1 autopilot had limitations. It had no altitude sensor, so it couldn't maintain a specific altitude without pilot input. It couldn't extend landing gear or adjust throttles or compensate for changing aircraft weight as fuel burned off. It was a basic system designed for one primary purpose: keeping the aircraft steady during the bomb run. Everything else required human attention. So how did the Phantom Fortress accomplish what it did? The answer lies in a convergence of circumstances that individually seem insignificant, but collectively created the conditions for the impossible. First, the weather. November 21st, 1944 saw prevailing winds from the east at approximately 30 to 40 knots. These tailwinds pushed the bomber westward, toward Allied territory, adding miles to its uncontrolled flight. Without those winds, the aircraft would have traveled a shorter distance and possibly crashed in German-held territory. Second, the cold. At altitude, air temperatures were well below freezing. Cold air is denser than warm air, providing more lift for a given airspeed. The increased air density helped keep the heavy bomber aloft longer than it would have managed in warmer conditions. It was a small effect, but meaningful when combined with other factors. Third, the trim settings. DeBolt had trimmed the aircraft for level flight before ordering the crew to bail. Those trim tabs remained set after he jumped, providing continuous control inputs that kept the aircraft stable. The elevator trim held the nose at a slight down angle, creating a slow, shallow descent rather than a dive. The aileron trim balanced the asymmetric thrust from the 2 remaining engines. The rudder trim compensated for the yaw created by the dead engines. Fourth, the autopilot. DeBolt confirmed he'd engaged the C-1 system before abandoning the aircraft. With the trim properly set and the autopilot maintaining heading, the bomber flew itself with surprising effectiveness. The gyroscopes detected any deviation from straight and level flight and corrected it through the servos. As long as the electrical system remained powered and the mechanical components functioned, the autopilot would continue doing its job. Fifth, fuel consumption. As the bomber flew westward, burning fuel from tanks in the wings and fuselage, the aircraft's weight decreased. This changed the center of gravity slightly, affecting handling characteristics. In most aircraft, these changes would require pilot input to maintain controlled flight. In the B-17, with its positive static stability and engaged autopilot, the aircraft adapted automatically within limits. Sixth, the engines themselves. 2 engines had failed or been shut down, but 2 remained running. These Wright R182097 Cyclone radial engines, each producing 1,200 horsepower, provided enough thrust to keep the bomber flying at reduced speed and altitude. The engines were synchronized before the crew bailed, running at similar RPM and producing balanced thrust. They continued running at those settings, burning fuel from tanks that still had enough for hours of flight. But none of this explains the landing gear. That remains the greatest mystery of the entire incident. The British soldiers on the ground unanimously reported seeing the bomber approach with its gear extended. Major Crisp found the gear down when he examined the aircraft after it stopped. Yet DeBolt couldn't remember lowering it and couldn't explain why he would have. The most plausible explanation involves the hydraulic system. The B-17 used electrically operated hydraulics for landing gear extension. If the hydraulic system developed a leak or pressure loss, either from battle damage or system failure, the gear might drop under gravity alone. Most multi-engine aircraft of that era had provisions for emergency gear extension that used gravity as backup to hydraulics. If someone had attempted to lower the gear manually before bailing, perhaps thinking it might help the aircraft survive a crash landing, the mechanism might have completed its cycle after that person left. The gear would have extended slowly as hydraulic pressure bled off, or as gravity pulled the heavy assemblies down against air resistance. By the time the bomber reached Belgium, the gear was locked in the down position, or perhaps the gear wasn't intentionally lowered at all. Perhaps an electrical malfunction or switch moved during the chaos triggered the extension sequence. Perhaps turbulence or the aircraft's pitching motion during descent caused fluid to move in the hydraulic lines in a way that released the gear locks. Perhaps it was pure chance, one more unlikely element in a string of unlikely circumstances. The landing itself, violent as it appeared, was actually a testament to the B-17's structural strength. The aircraft touched down at excessive speed, with no flare, no reduction in descent rate, no pilot finesse. It hit the ground hard enough to crumple one propeller and tear up the belly. Yet the fuselage didn't break. The wings didn't separate. The bombs didn't detonate. The aircraft ground-looped and stopped, damaged but intact. Boeing had built the Flying Fortress using semi-monocoque construction with heavy-gauge aluminum alloy frames and stressed skin covering. The structure distributed loads efficiently across the entire airframe. Every component was overbuilt by modern standards, designed to absorb punishment and keep flying. That engineering philosophy, intended to protect crews from enemy fire, also protected the empty aircraft from its own uncontrolled landing. After the investigation concluded and the story spread throughout the Allied air forces, engineers and pilots debated what lessons could be learned. Some argued the incident proved autopilots could be improved to handle more of the flying workload. Others insisted it demonstrated the importance of inherent stability in aircraft design. Still others claimed it was pure luck, and no lessons could be drawn from a single anomalous event. The truth probably incorporated all three perspectives. The Phantom Fortress succeeded because of good design, properly functioning systems, favorable conditions, and extraordinary luck. Remove any one of those factors and the outcome would have been different. Consider what would have happened if the winds had been from the west instead of east. The bomber would have traveled east, deeper into Germany, until it crashed in enemy territory or was shot down by German fighters who wouldn't have recognized the American markings in time. No one would ever know the crew had bailed out. The aircraft would have been just another combat loss. Consider what would have happened if DeBolt had trimmed the aircraft incorrectly before jumping. A nose-heavy trim would have put the bomber into a dive that even the autopilot couldn't correct. A nose-light trim would have caused the aircraft to climb until it stalled and fell. Only the precise trim settings DeBolt chose, almost by accident, allowed controlled descent. Consider what would have happened if one more engine had failed during the uncrewed flight. The remaining engine couldn't have provided enough thrust to sustain flight. The bomber would have descended faster, possibly too fast for the autopilot to maintain control. It would have crashed short of Allied territory, probably into the forests or fields of occupied France or Belgium. Consider what would have happened if the electrical system had failed. The autopilot needed power to operate the servos that moved the control surfaces. Without electricity, the gyroscopes would have spun down, and the servos would have stopped functioning. The aircraft would have gradually departed from controlled flight and entered a spiral or spin. Consider what would have happened if the hydraulic system had failed completely instead of just allowing the gear to drop. Without hydraulics, the landing gear would have remained retracted. The bomber would have belly landed with even more violence, possibly breaking apart on impact or starting a fire that could have reached the bombs. Any one of these alternative outcomes was more probable than what actually occurred. That's what made the Phantom Fortress so extraordinary. It succeeded against overwhelming odds through a confluence of factors that individually seem unremarkable, but collectively created a miracle of engineering and chance. The broader context of strategic bombing makes this story even more significant. By late 1944, the 8th Air Force was flying massive raids over Germany with hundreds of bombers per mission. Losses were heavy despite fighter escorts. Every crew lived with the knowledge that statistics said they probably wouldn't survive their tour of duty. The sight of damaged bombers struggling back to England was commonplace. The sight of empty bombers landing themselves was not. The Phantom Fortress became a symbol of hope for those crews. If an empty aircraft could find its way home, maybe a damaged one with a determined crew could too. The psychological impact of the story, embellished and retold countless times, gave crews confidence that translated to persistence under fire. It made them more willing to fight for survival, to stay with damaged aircraft, to believe that engineering and luck might save them when skill wasn't enough. But the story also highlighted how fragile the entire enterprise was. Daylight strategic bombing depended on bombers reaching their targets despite determined opposition. The B-17's defensive firepower and structural toughness made that possible, but just barely. German fighters and flak destroyed thousands of fortresses during the war. 12,732 B-17 seconds were built. 4,735 were lost during combat missions, a loss rate of 37.2%. Think about that number. More than 1 in 3 flying fortresses built during the war were shot down. For every aircraft that landed itself mysteriously in Belgium, dozens crashed in flames over Germany, or ditched in the North Sea, or disintegrated from direct hits. The miracle of the Phantom Fortress existed against a backdrop of mechanical devastation that consumed machines and men with industrial efficiency. The men who flew these missions understood this better than anyone. They saw the empty bunks in their barracks, the missing aircraft at morning briefings, the names erased from duty rosters. They knew their chances and flew anyway because the strategic mission demanded it. The destruction of German industrial capacity and oil production required sustained bombing despite losses. The B-17 was the tool chosen for that mission, and its crews were the men who wielded it. When those crews heard about the ghost ship, they saw it through the lens of their own experiences. They'd all seen B-17 seconds do impossible things. They'd watched aircraft with engines dead and wings shredded somehow make it back to England. They'd heard stories of bombers that should have exploded but didn't, of crews that should have died but survived. One more impossible story fit perfectly into their understanding of what the Flying Fortress could do. The engineering that made such stories possible was pragmatic rather than sophisticated. Boeing didn't build the B-17 to be elegant or efficient, they built it to be survivable. Every design decision reflected that priority: heavy structure instead of minimum weight, redundant systems instead of simplified engineering, defensive armament instead of speed or payload. The result was an aircraft that could absorb punishment and keep flying, that forgave errors and compensated for damage, that brought crews home when lesser aircraft would have failed. The Phantom Fortress took that survivability to its logical extreme. It didn't just survive damage. It survived abandonment. It flew itself across hostile territory, navigated to Allied airspace, descended through clouds and turbulence, extended its landing gear, and put itself on the ground without human assistance. Every system worked exactly as designed despite having no pilot to monitor them. The autopilot maintained heading. The engines ran at constant power. The trim tabs held the control surfaces at optimal angles. The inherent stability kept the wings level, and the nose at the right attitude. This wasn't artificial intelligence or autonomous control. It was simple, mechanical and aerodynamic systems doing their jobs under unusual circumstances. The same systems that helped pilots bomb targets accurately helped an abandoned bomber fly itself home. The difference was that this time, there was no pilot to disengage the systems or override their inputs. The machine was left to its own devices, and those devices proved surprisingly capable. The fact that the landing gear extended remains the one element that suggests something more than pure mechanism at work. But even that can be explained through hydraulic failure and gravity, without invoking supernatural intervention. The gear dropping might have been the luckiest failure in aviation history, but it was still just a failure that happened to occur at the right time and place. After the war ended in May of 1945, the ghost ship story became part of Air Force lore. Veterans told it to new recruits. Historians included it in accounts of the bombing campaign. Aviation enthusiasts debated the technical explanations. But the men who lived through it, DeBolt and his crew, generally remained quiet about the experience. They'd bailed out of what they believed was a dying aircraft, following proper procedure and saving their own lives. The fact that the aircraft survived without them was embarrassing in a way. It suggested they'd panicked or made poor decisions or abandoned a salvageable bomber. None of that was true. They'd made the right call based on the information available to them. The aircraft's survival was an anomaly they couldn't have predicted. DeBolt completed his tour shortly after and went home to California. He married, raised a family, worked a civilian job, and rarely discussed the war. When asked about the Phantom Fortress, he would acknowledge the facts but resist speculation about how it happened. "She didn't need me after all," he said once, and that simple statement captured his feelings better than any lengthy explanation could have. Osborne Stone lived to age 90 in Derry, New Hampshire, the co-pilot who jumped at 800 feet on his first and last parachute descent. He kept a photograph of the aircraft sitting in the Belgian field, a reminder of the day his bomber came home without him. In his later years, he would sometimes show the photograph to visitors and tell the story, still amazed decades later that an aircraft could do such a thing. The bomber itself was eventually scrapped. The hard landing had damaged the airframe beyond economical repair, and by late 1944, replacement B-17 seconds were being produced faster than crews could be trained to fly them. The aircraft was stripped for parts and the rest sent to salvage. Its metal probably ended up in other bombers, continuing the war effort in a different form. But the legend endured. In pilot-ready rooms and maintenance hangars, on bases across England and later in peacetime America, the story of the Phantom Fortress was told and retold. Each telling added small embellishments. Some versions had the bomber making multiple passes over the field before landing. Others claimed the engines shut down exactly as the aircraft stopped rolling. Still others insisted strange lights were seen in the cockpit as it flew overhead. These embellishments are natural to any legend, but they obscure the more impressive reality. An ordinary B-17, damaged in combat and abandoned by its crew, flew itself for dozens of miles, navigated to Allied territory, descended safely, extended its landing gear, and executed something resembling a landing, all with no one aboard. No supernatural intervention required. Just good engineering, proper procedures, favorable conditions, and remarkable luck. That's the real story of the ghost ship. Not ghosts or miracles or divine intervention. Just a well-designed aircraft with engaged systems doing what they were designed to do under extraordinary circumstances. The B-17 Flying Fortress earned its name through thousands of missions and hundreds of crew saved by its toughness. The Phantom Fortress earned its legend by proving that sometimes, just sometimes, the machine itself was enough. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the story is what it revealed about the men who flew these missions. They faced terrible odds every day. They climbed into aircraft that might not bring them home. They flew through flak and fighters, watching friends die beside them, knowing their turn might come at any moment. Yet they continued flying because the mission required it. When those men heard that an abandoned B-17 had landed itself safely, they didn't see it as a reason to abandon aircraft more quickly. They saw it as confirmation that their machines were worth fighting for, that the Flying Fortress would do everything possible to bring them home. The ghost ship became an argument for staying with damaged aircraft rather than bailing out prematurely. That was probably not the lesson military planners wanted emphasized. Encouraging crews to stay with doomed aircraft would lead to unnecessary casualties. But the story took on a life of its own, beyond official control. It became part of the mythology of the air war over Europe, One more tale of American engineering and determination triumphing over impossible odds. The technical reality was more prosaic but equally fascinating. The C-1 autopilot, when properly engaged and trimmed, could maintain heading and approximate altitude for considerable periods. The B-17's inherent stability provided backup when the autopilot couldn't compensate perfectly. The two remaining engines provided enough thrust for sustained flight at reduced altitude. The hydraulic system, whether by design or failure, extended the landing gear at an appropriate time. The aircraft's structural strength absorbed a landing that would have destroyed weaker designs. None of these elements were individually extraordinary. Autopilots existed on many aircraft. Aerodynamic stability was a known design principle. Engine redundancy was standard on multi-engine bombers. Strong structure was a Boeing trademark. But the combination of all these elements, working together without human intervention, created an outcome that seemed impossible. And that's what makes the Phantom Fortress story ultimately meaningful. It demonstrates that good engineering, when executed properly and given favorable circumstances, can achieve results that appear miraculous. It shows that safety margins and redundant systems and conservative design choices pay dividends in ways that can't always be predicted. It proves that overbuilding aircraft to protect crews creates machines that can survive even the absence of those crews. Modern aircraft design has moved away from the flying fortress philosophy. Contemporary aircraft are optimized for efficiency rather than toughness, for minimum weight rather than maximum strength. They rely on sophisticated computers and fly-by-wire systems rather than inherent stability. They work brilliantly when everything functions correctly, but have smaller margins for error when things go wrong. Would a modern aircraft fly itself home with no crew aboard? Almost certainly not. The computerized systems would eventually fail without pilot input. The engines would shut down when sensors detected anomalies without human override. The tight stability margins optimized for efficiency would allow the aircraft to depart from controlled flight. The lightweight structure might not survive a hard landing like the one that merely damaged the Phantom Fortress. The B-17 came from an era when aviation was still relatively simple, when mechanical systems dominated, when overbuilding was standard practice because engineers didn't fully understand stress limits. Those attributes, anachronistic by modern standards, allowed an abandoned bomber to accomplish something a contemporary aircraft probably couldn't duplicate. So the Ghost ship stands as a monument to a particular moment in aviation history, when aircraft were tough enough to survive their own crashes, when autopilots were simple enough to keep running without supervision, when designs prioritized survival over efficiency, when engineering margins were large enough to accommodate the impossible. The men of the 91st Bombardment Group who flew the Phantom Fortress on November 21, 1944, didn't know they were creating a legend. They were just trying to survive another mission over Germany. They made reasonable decisions based on the information available. They bailed out of what appeared to be a doomed aircraft and landed safely in Allied territory. Mission accomplished, crew saved, aircraft lost. Except the aircraft wasn't lost. It flew home on its own and landed in a Belgian field, engines running, gear down, waiting for a crew that would never return. The British soldiers who witnessed it couldn't believe their eyes. Major Crisp, who climbed aboard, couldn't explain what he found. The investigators who studied it could document what happened but couldn't quite explain how. 70 years later, the technical explanations seem clear. Autopilot, trim, stability, favorable conditions, luck. But technical explanations don't diminish the story. They enhance it by showing how carefully designed systems, when properly used, can achieve extraordinary results. The Phantom Fortress wasn't a miracle. It was good engineering, meeting extraordinary circumstances and producing an outcome that seemed miraculous. That's the real lesson of the Ghost ship. Not that machines are magical, but that they are reliable. Not that human pilots are unnecessary, but that their tools are capable. Not that abandoning aircraft is safe, but that the B-17 Flying Fortress earned its name through engineering decisions that prioritized crew survival above all else. And on November 21, 1944, those engineering decisions combined with circumstance and fortune to create the legend of the bomber that flew itself home. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.